Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and this is my life as a landlord. I'm so pleased you've joined me for today's show. And today we are exploring location-specific tenancy guidelines for the great state of Nebraska. Now, in all of my location-specific episodes, I have included hyperlinks for all kinds of resources to the state landlord tenant law code. In this case, it's the Nebraska Landlord Tenant Act and other resources that I could find. Now, if you haven't listened to one of my location-specific podcasts, they're all set up the exact same way, answering the exact same four questions. And those questions are pretty standard for our framework. What are the basics of the Landlord Tenancy Act for that state, in this case, Nebraska? What are the nuances of this location? What have I found that stands out? We'll go through that as well. 3, some guidance on what do you do with abandoned items left behind by a tenant in Nebraska. And then 4, where to get help in your local area in Nebraska. Now, I must tell you that there are more guiding documents, there are more resources than what I am giving you here. This is not everything. This will just get you started and give you some guidance, but there may be other things for your local state, county, city, like perhaps you need to register your rental, perhaps you need to be licensed. Now, typically I find out the big things, but all the little nuances, that is where you need to come in and do your own research. So this episode is not all inclusive, but it will get you started. Before we get going here, I want to put in a plug for today's sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you want to know more about real estate investing, check out alohajv.com. That's alohajulietVictor.com. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if you're watching me on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord, you're going to see that I'm going to be screen sharing with you. I'm not on camera during these location-specific podcasts because you don't need to be looking at me while I'm screen sharing. But here we go. So what I've done here is I've just pulled up the Landlord Tenant Act for Nebraska. And you will see that in all of these landlord-specific or location-specific podcasts, that the tenancy laws are actually a law. So this is the actual real estate law. You'll see this Nebraska Real Estate Commission. It is actually a law. Most places are like this. Almost all of them are. And so you've got the legalese part. And so it's very, very specific. You've got all of your different sections. It goes down just some of the terms in here that you can see: terms and conditions of the rental agreement. Landlord must require the premises to be fit. Fire or casualty damage, what do you do in that? Action for possession, default of defendant, things like this. And so this is all the legalese part. Now, in this case, typically in locations, there is always a different document that helps users in a very different way, like a fact sheet, an info sheet, a guide, something else. So let me pull that up. Now, of course, these hyperlinks are all in the description for today's show. And so I've just switched to the Landlord Tenant Handbook for the Nebraska Landlord Tenant Act. And so you've got, it's 71 pages. The PDF, like I said, is in the hyperlink is in the description of the show, but what it is, so it goes right into where you can get help right off the hop. And so page 2, hotline information, it gives you the website of Legal Aid of Nebraska.org. And then there's a bunch of phone numbers, like a bunch of phone numbers that you can call and the hours that they can be reached. And they've got a number of, let's go through the table of contents here, but I'm not going to go through every single thing in this guide. But what I am going to do is I'm going to scroll down. There is, we're just going to go through the layout, and then we're going to go through some of the nuances and go from there. Okay, so it goes right into terms to know. And so it defines, tenant, landlord, rental agreement, sublease, utilities, eviction, security deposit. This is something that always gets confused, because a security deposit, yes, it's paid in money, but it's still the tenant's money. And so Nebraska defines this as money that a new tenant pays in addition to the rent and application fees as a measure of security to the landlord. the landlord then holds this money so they can pay it for repairs or rent owed after the tenant moves out. If the tenant does not owe rent and leaves the property clean and in good repair, landlord must return security deposit within 14 days after the tenant moves out. By law, a security deposit cannot be more than the amount of 1 month's rent. So there you go. Landlords can charge an extra pet deposit or a fee if the tenant has pets. By law, a pet deposit cannot be more than 1/4 of 1 month's rent. So this is where you get the different deposits. So you've got a pet deposit that can't be more than 1/4. You've got your security deposit that can't be more than 1 month's rent. But you can see very quickly, if you are an incoming tenant and you've got to pay application fees, you've got to pay security deposit. Let's say you have a pet, so you've got to pay a quarter deposit, and then you've got to pay first month's rent to actually get the keys to get into the unit. This is quite the sum in Nebraska to get into a unit, but that's the way that Nebraska does it, which is good. At least it's spelled out, because there's a lot of places that don't have things completely spelled out like this. So one thing that's interesting, Nebraska also defines essential services. Now, maybe this is inherent in other places, but this is really interesting. I've seen it called vital services, but here they call it essential. And what it is heat, hot and cold running water, not just hot and cold water, hot and cold running water, sewage or septic disposal, and electricity. And there's also a note, it says this may also include gas or air conditioning if your lease or local law requires the landlord to supply those services to the tenant. Interesting. I love that they include hot and cold running water. I've seen hot and cold water, very legalese, right? Yeah. Okay, so it keeps coming. We're still defining tenants here, and there's all kinds of different ones. Notice to quit, mutual termination agreement, restitution of premises. What is a summons? Plaintiff, defendant. And of course, in this instance, if you have a dispute, you go right to court unless you can figure out mediation in advance, which is an option here. Let's see. They have something called an answer. What's an answer? A court document that a defendant files in response. Okay, so let's say someone's going to sue you, you have a complaint, so that it's a plaintiff. If you're the defendant, you're going to answer. Okay, that's what that is defined. Unlawful ouster. I think this is an interesting term. We've seen it called in other places where you have illegal lockouts, where the way that Nebraska defines it here, the legal term for when a landlord evicts a tenant without a court order. Unlawful ousters can happen when a landlord changes the locks or shut off utility services like gas, electricity, or water in an effort to force the tenant to leave. And then they have a separate guidance that's called the landlord has locked you out further in the document. We're going to talk about this. The other thing that Nebraska does that's interesting is called abuse of access. Now, I've not actually heard this term before, so I really like that they put this, but it's when a landlord misuses their right to access a rental unit. Hang on a sec. When a landlord misuses their right to access a rental unit, unless there is an emergency, the landlord cannot enter the unit without first giving the tenant written notice at least 24 hours in advance and getting the tenant's consent to enter. So abuse of access is when the landlord is just big fat doing whatever they want, going in. That's not ideal. That's not good. Abuse of access. And then the two final definitions are hearing and default judgment. Now, what's interesting is that none of this stuff is in alphabetical order. It's just sort of there. So there's really no rhyme or reason to this, but that's okay. And then logically it goes in. I'm on page 11. Before you rent, this is of course guidance to the potential tenant, talking about touring the unit, what to look for, apply to live there, and then what's in a rental agreement. Of course, we're talking about written versus verbal. I am never a fan of a verbal rental agreement because there's always he said, she said. So everything should be in writing. You should have a lease and everything should be written down. And so they actually in Nebraska at the very last page, very last line of this page, it says you still have rights under a verbal agreement. But on the very next page, it says it's almost always better for you to have a written rental agreement. Well, duh, that's good. Okay, what to look for in your rental agreement: length of tenancy, your rent amount, rent due date, where to pay, how to pay. These are all important. And actually what they do is they have the Nebraska revised statute number for the law, which right there, which is actually really cool that they have it right there. They talk about rent receipts. Oh, late fees. Here we go. Your rental agreement may include late fees if you pay your rent late. These are fees that you must pay in addition to the full rent amount. It's important that you always pay your rent on time, even if your agreement does not have a late fee. If you fail to pay your late fees, it could lead to eviction, impact your credit and tenant data reports. Now, this is really important. It doesn't say what it is. It doesn't say how a late fee would work. There are other locations that are very specific, certain amount of days. Is there a grace period? None of that is in Nebraska. Now, the one thing that is in Nebraska is that there's no apparent grace period, but at 7 days, you can demand to pay rent. And so you're going to see here, there is a pay or quit note in Nebraska. So you're getting up to 7 days, but as another landlord, as a landlord, a longtime landlord, I know that if I actually have to get out my documents and I have to start serving people and I have to start posting notices because the rent is not paid, and I'm starting to worry about paying things like mortgages and insurance payments, that is going to stress me out. That's going to really not make me happy. So come on, for my tenants, they know this. If I have to go in and even start talking about late fees, that's a problem. So it's not very well spelled out in Nebraska at all. It's not specific. And so basically, if you're a landlord in Nebraska, you need to make sure you've got a late fee clause in there, exactly what it is, how many days. Maybe it's, rent is due on or before midnight on the 1st of the month. And so if they're not paid by the 1st of the month at midnight, on the 2nd, you can say your late fee is now charged, pay as soon as possible, and then give them a demand letter. I mean, the only thing that they don't include in here is the amount. Typically we would say a reasonable amount, not to include maybe 5 or 10% of the landlord, the rental amount. So it just depends on what you've got, but make sure if you're a landlord in Nebraska, make sure you've got something in there for late fees. Raising the rent. This is another thing that is interesting and typical in leases for tenancies is if you have a rental agreement, landlord cannot raise the rent during the period of time that you're renting under that agreement. So if you're got a year lease, you obviously cannot change any of the terms of that lease, including the rent amount. But if you're renting on a month-to-month agreement, landlord cannot raise your rent without warning you. Before your landlord can raise your rent under a month-to-month agreement, they must give you notice in writing. Of course, it must be in writing. It must be at least 30 days before your next due date. But it's not clear how much the landlord is allowed to raise the rent. Doesn't say, and it might come up as we go through here, it doesn't say what the amount is. If it might just be whatever the amount is based on you can base on market rate, it could be based on actual costs. Yeah. Okay, so here it goes into security deposit again. Utilities, repairs, there is under Nebraska law, landlord must keep the rental property in good repair, and tenants can make requests to make repairs. And of course, if the landlord fails to do that, then the tenant can take matters into their own hand and repair and deduct. But you've got to do it properly. You've got, if a tenant's going to do that, they've got to do it properly. You can't just, send them a text saying, hey, I want you to fix this, and then they just do it. It doesn't work like that. Now, this is interesting because Nebraska, on page 18, this is where it's talking about number of people and guests. This is a very very rarely talked about item where you have the occupancy number in a rental unit. So this one says most rental rental agreements state the number of people who can live in the unit. Make sure your rental agreement lists all the people living with you, and the people listed on the rental agreement are the only people who are allowed to live with you. You need the landlord's written permission before someone already not on the rental agreement can move in. If you want someone to move in, this person needs to be added to the agreement, and with some exceptions, the landlord has discretion to not add people to the lease. And so rental agreements may also state how long a guest may stay before adding to the lease. You should always tell your landlord before you have someone new move in with you. And we have a process in our lease addendums in every single one of our leases where it says, if you want to move, if you want to add a roommate, here is how you do it. And basically they have to go through the whole application process. You have to go through everything, make sure that you're not over your being limit for that unit. I mean, if you've got a 1-bedroom and you're at 3 people or 2 people plus a couple of pets, I mean, if you're at max density and you want someone to move in and sleep on your couch in a 1-bedroom, we're likely going to say, no, that's not going to work. However, there are certain circumstances where you may need that. You may need that even for temporarily, right? So that's interesting though. There's only a couple other places that I have seen to date where they're talking about occupancy and making sure that, you know, who's living in there is actually noted in the rental agreement. One thing that you might consider as a landlord that I do specifically is the lease states who is permitted to live there, not just 2 adults and 1 child. I actually put their names and say these 3 people are allowed to live in this unit. I even put the pets and no one else is allowed. Further, I put in the lease addendums that the guests can only stay up to 10 days or 14 days. I forget what it is. I think it's 10 days. And they're not allowed to have a key. They are not allowed to have a key to the unit. Now, I'm sure this happens, but I put it in there specifically because if they end up having a key, that implies that they are staying longer term and they're not necessarily a guest. So that's something that you might consider putting in your lease addendum. That's how we do it. It may or may not work for you, but there's an idea for you. All right, continuing on, we've got pets. This is all about the pet deposit. Also, it's talking about make sure your specific pet is allowed. Some buildings have species, breed, or weight restrictions on pets or types of enclosures. Now, for those of you who have listened to the show, I've got quite a bit about pets, talking about species of pets, breeds of pets, pets of certain weight. And in this, it's talking, Nebraska completely spells it out and says, this means that specific species of pets, including dogs, cats, snakes, fish, and specific breeds of pets, including pit bull, golden retriever, etc., may or may not be allowed. Okay, excuse me. So how do you know? Well, first thing I do is I pick up the phone and I call my insurance agent and I say, is there any breeds or types of pets that my insurance will not cover? It's pretty cut and dry. If they say, you know what, we do not want fish tanks, we do not want pit bulls, we do not want Dalmatians or Dachshunds, whatever it might be, the insurance is the governing doctrine. If you go against the insurance and there is a loss, guess what? You are liable yourself, not the insurance policy. So make sure you are doing a check with your insurance agent to know what your insurance covers and what it does not cover. So there's all kinds of episodes on pets and animals in general in the My Life as a Landlord library. So, but it's interesting that Nebraska specifically spells it out. Absences from your unit. If you are a tenant and you are going on vacation, this one says if you will be away from your unit for 7 days or more, which I really appreciate when our tenants say, hey, I'm going to visit my mom back east for 3 months. I appreciate that, especially if they've got an automatic payment for their rent. So I want to make sure that we know that they are going to be gone. And so if we're posting notices, that we don't post a notice on their door and it's obvious that they're not there. That's not good. So I like that they put that in there and make sure. Now there are other notes. It says there are special rules if you have a Section 8 housing voucher. That's government assistance. And so I'm just going to leave that there. If that applies to you, read that. Lead paint. This is something that is a federal mandate in the US. Buildings built before 1978 were painted with paint that was made of lead. And so it's talking about the landlords have to give a disclosure or concern about lead paint in your unit. And the PDF is in here. In fact, I found this everywhere when I was doing these location specific podcasts, that these are all everywhere. This is a health issue. So make sure that you are doing this. You're doing this disclosure. Even if your unit doesn't apply to this, make sure you're still doing it. Blank spaces. It says, do not sign over. This is to the tenant. Do not sign a rental agreement with blank spaces in it. And then, of course, there's always a note, and Nebraska is no different. It says what cannot be in your rental agreement. Basically, the lease agreement can't say, yes, I'm guilty. That it can't require any person to confess they're responsible for an issue coming out of the rental agreement. It can't make you responsible for paying your landlord's attorney fees. I mean, it basically can't incriminate yourself. It's interesting. And just about every single tenancy law that I've ever seen says this, that you can't make an agreement that will incriminate or, exonerate people. You can't do that, which I get it. All right, moving on. I'm at the bottom of page 20, and get a copy of the rental agreement. Now, this is something that it says that it's sort of like recommended, but in other locations, it's required for the landlord to deliver a copy of the signed lease within so many days. Nebraska isn't that specific. It just says you should get a copy of the rental agreement you sign. Your landlord should provide a copy of the lease at the time you sign it. Yeah, so that's fine. It is a good idea. It's just not required in certain days to deliver. The landlord doesn't have to deliver it. So then it's talking about move-in checklist, get a copy of the lease, take photos of the unit, check for damages, fill out a condition checklist, and there is a sample conditions checklist that you can use. Problems at the start of your tenancy. So if the landlord won't let you move in, we've seen this in a couple of times when you've got an issue that the landlord can't fix in time for you to actually move in. So the Nebraska spells it out, says this is this is the problem. And then let's see, you find problems right after you move in, landlord refuses to fix the problem. So there's guidance on all of this. So this was all before you rent. And then while you're renting, it spells out the landlord responsibilities, which is actually really good. It spells out the responsibilities as a tenant, when your landlord can enter your unit. And yeah, so this is really interesting. And then it says when a landlord this talks about the abuse of access. A landlord cannot enter your unit. Basically, if it's not an emergency, you don't have permission, you don't have consent, and it's an unreasonable time. Goodness. So typically there'll be specific hours, and usually it's like 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., whatever. Nebraska is not as specific as all that, but they just said unreasonable times, like at the middle of the night. Your landlord and their employees and agents should generally enter during normal business hours of the day. It makes sense, right? And they cannot repeatedly request to come into your unit without good reason. Like if they're trying to make a repair, that's one thing, especially if it's an emergent repair, trying to get done and trying to get out of your hair. I get it. Okay, this is still during your tenancy. Sending notices. If you need to send notice, put the notice in writing. It also talks about sending it either certified mail or first class mail. Problems while renting: no running water, hot water, heat, electricity, or gas. So this is interesting because it says your landlord cannot interfere with your access to electricity, gas, hot and cold running water. This is interesting how this all is very well spelled out, which tells me if it's this well spelled out, this has been a problem, either a problem in the past or they set it up this way and never changed it. I just wonder, if you're a landlord in Nebraska, would you comment on this, wherever platform you are listening to this on, whether it be YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify? Please comment on this, because I want to know, is this really a problem? Are you guys having this many problems, especially with utilities? It doesn't appear this is a problem like this in other locations, but just based on the amount of listing of shutting off utilities, it just seems like maybe it has been a problem in the past. I don't know. Okay, so let's see. It's talking more about, your different options. So if the landlord has unwillfully shut off some utilities, option A, if you want to stay in the unit, option B, if you want to end your tenancy. And of course, the whole time it's talking about go to legalaidofnebraska.org or talk to a lawyer before taking certain steps. Further, what do you do if the landlord won't make repairs? If you want option A, if you want to stay in the unit, option B, if you want to end the tenancy. And of course, you're giving notice, written notice, the entire time. Now, this is going into, on page 29, this is going into retaliation by the landlord. Now, whenever we talk about retaliation of the landlord, it's typically to penalize the tenant for some item, whether they've, there's been a report to one of the governing bodies like the city or the county or the health inspector, and the landlord is trying to retaliate, or it appears the landlord is trying to retaliate through either a rent increase, loss of use, trying to evict them. And it's always about the time. It's always about how much time since that initial complaint from the tenant initiating a complaint has lapsed, so that it looks like the landlord is retaliating. And maybe they are trying to retaliate. I understand this, but it's the time limit. And so in Nebraska, it is the time, hang on a second, I'm just looking through here. The land, yeah, raising your rent, decreasing services, evicting you, local housing court. Okay, I'm trying to find, doesn't say the time. And usually it's a certain amount of months, and it doesn't say retaliation on landlord. Interesting. So it might just be that if any of this happens to you, then it doesn't, it just straight up doesn't say. Okay. Well, then it's retaliation basically for the end of the tenancy, which is the longest I've seen. Usually there's certain amount of time, whether it's 2 months, 3 months, I've seen up to 6 months. I've actually seen up to a year, where it's, if any of those things happen, raising rent, decreasing services, or trying to evict a tenant, then it appears that the landlord is retaliating. And it says in Nebraska that there is no timeline, meaning any time after that, which is kind of surprising, but that's the way it is. I get it. Okay, what to do if the landlord has locked you out? Now, first of all, if you're a landlord hearing this, don't do this. This is not good. This is not setting you up for success at all. And of course, the first thing that the state of Nebraska says is call the police. This is not good. Should talk to a lawyer. What to do if fire, flood, natural disasters. And then, of course, if you've got damage to your unit, other issues. So other issues that may come up while you're renting, communicate through writing. Make sure you're paying your rent and your utilities on time. Make sure you're getting a receipt. And okay, so that's all while renting. So then it comes to the end of your tenancy. You may want to move out. If you have a written rental agreement, one of the things that I always look for is when you've got a fixed tenancy, like a year-long lease, at the end of that, does it automatically convert to a month-to-month, or does it end abruptly? And it looks like if you've got a mutual termination agreement, it doesn't automatically convert. It doesn't look like it automatically converts. It's an abrupt ending. But it looks like if you agree on that, then it depends on what's in the lease. That's what it looks like. Okay, this is really interesting for Nebraska. I'm actually really liking what I'm about to tell you. There is something called a 14 30-day notice, and it works both for landlords and for tenants. This is actually really, really savvy. And so what it is sample 14 30-day notice, 30-day notice to terminate if the repairs are not made in 14 days. So if a landlord has not made a repair and a tenant is going to basically demand that the landlord make that repair, so they're saying, make the repairs in 14 days, or I'm giving you notice to terminate in 30 days. Now, it also works the other way around. A landlord can give a tenant a 14 30-day notice. So it says, look, basically, if you're not fixing, if there's some kind of mischief going on, if there's some kind of behavior, whether they're being loud or they haven't picked up their garbage, they're not being clean, whatever it might be, some kind of material term in the lease, the landlord can give a tenant a 14 30-day notice as well. This is really interesting that you've got this sort of time frame. So what that would do is So the landlord would give them 14 days, give the tenant 14 days basically to smarten up, to fix whatever the behavior is, or 30 days to terminate the lease. So really interesting how this all works. I really like this, that it works for both the landlord and the tenant. I've not seen that before. It seems like every single aspect has a different date or different deadline or whatever. In Nebraska, it's pretty standard. I think that's really neat, actually. Okay, continuing on page 33, domestic abuse. This is talking about having to terminate the lease early due to some kind of domestic violence. Make sure that you, if this is going on, make sure that there is police documentation, and you've got to make sure that you are, being cognizant of, you want to keep your unit safe as a landlord. You want to keep your unit and your tenants safe. Okay, so when this goes into further, it goes, your landlord wants you to move out, meaning if you've not paid rent. And so if you haven't paid rent, give a 7-day notice to pay, or basically 7 days to pay, 14 days to get out. I think I'm reading that right. Tenancy will end if you don't pay with a 7-day notice. So that's the demand for payment. If your landlord wants you to move out because you've broken the terms of the rental agreement, we just talked about this, 30-day notice, 13 day. Oh, it says your tenancy will end in 30 days. So if, let me back up here. If you've got a tenant that's misbehaving and you've got the terms of the lease have been broken, then the tenant has 14 days to fix the problem, and your tenancy will end in 30 days if you don't fix the problem within 14 days. So basically, you have 14 days to smarten up. If you don't smarten up in 14 days, that says that at the end of 30 days, the tenancy is ending. It's pretty serious, but I've seen that in other locations. It's just called something different. I really like that. The other thing that is really interesting in Nebraska, they talk about criminal activity. If your landlord wants you to move out because someone has engaged in criminal activity, they must give you a 5-day notice. That is the fastest I've seen. And it specifically asks, it says, specifically lists a number of really specific things for the criminal activity. And so I'm just going to read a couple of these. It says, your landlord may give you this type of notice if you or someone in your household, your guest, or someone else on the premises with your permission engaged in physical assault, threat of physical assault, illegal use of gun or other weapon, threat of illegal use of gun or other weapon, illegal sale of drugs, illegal possession of drugs, or any other activity that threatens the health or safety of others. So, and it says, note, a landlord can give you a 5-day notice, even if the person has not been arrested or convicted of a crime, and you may seek some protections if you did not engage in the criminal activity and you seek a protective order or restraining order against the person who engaged in the activity. You reported the activity to the police. So, I mean, if this is happening on the property and the tenant is actively engaged, obviously you're going to want, as a landlord, you're going to want to give the 5-day notice for this criminal activity. If this is occurring and your tenant is not actually involved, then there is some effort to preserve that tenancy with that tenant. So this is getting pretty serious here. If you've got this going on and you're talking about criminal activity and 5-day notices, it says right here, what do you do if you get a 5-day notice? Contact a lawyer right away. And if you do not move out within 5 days, your landlord can file a case to evict you. Now, this is saying that the tenant is actually involved some way in this criminal activity. Okay, so this is still continuing on if the landlord wants the tenant out. And if the tenant is going to use if the landlord is going to use the unit for themselves or substantially renovate for another reason, it talks about how to do this. It talks about eviction and what to do when you go to court. It has a general overview of the eviction process. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole thing. This is about giving notice, giving all kinds of different things, avoiding evictions. If the landlord starts the case, how to serve, how to respond, what the defenses are, and then how to do a counterclaim if you wanted to do a counterclaim. And I'm just scrolling through this. This is on page 40, what to bring to the hearing. And if you have a hearing, what to do, what the whole thing looks like. This is pretty serious. This is going to be very intimidating if you are going through this as a landlord for the first time. By the way, if you think you have an eviction coming up and you've got to do this, I highly, highly recommend that you go to court and watch this. Just watch one. Just watch even for an hour and just understand how this all works and how, how the bailiff works, how the judge works. Just go and watch, because that will remove a bit of the anxiety, not all. It will remove a bit of the anxiety for you if you have to go to court. Now, if you're a landlord long enough, regardless of the state, you will have to go through some kind of eviction or some kind of hearing. So just prepare. That's going to have to happen at some point if you're in business long enough. So I prepare yourself by going and watching in advance, so you know what it feels like, what it looks like. So when it gets to you, you kind of have an idea of how this all works. And honestly, even the simple stuff like where to park, how to get in, what can you bring in the courthouse, all this stuff is not in any of these tenant laws, none of it. And that can be just as like, what do you wear? Can you wear, shorts and flip-flops? I mean, I'm in Hawaii, but is that exactly what you can do in Nebraska? Or are you expected to wear a suit? Are you expected to, like in Texas, they talk about carrying a gun. Well, obviously you can't wear that in the courthouse, but what can you do? What should you do? What should you bring? This is all prep for yourself. So if this is where you think something is headed for you in Nebraska or wherever you are, make sure you go and you kind of learn the game in advance so that you are not super intimidated. Now, granted, every time we have to do a hearing or we have to go to court, I am nervous. I have anxiety every single time. So don't think that will ever go away, but you can at least try to mitigate some of that anxiety for yourself. Okay, let me keep going here. We're talking about Nebraska. This is, we're talking at the end of page 43, sheriff or constable moves your property out. And this is talking about after an eviction has been awarded, getting your personal property back. And then, of course, it shifts to a move out checklist because most of your tenancies shouldn't end in eviction. And so it's talking about cleaning your unit, taking photos, giving your landlord your new address, and asking for your security deposit back, getting your security deposit back, what your landlord can deduct from your security deposit, what you can do if your landlord doesn't return your security deposit within 14 days of move out. Basically what ends up happening is you submit in Nebraska, you submit a demand for security deposit, and then you end up going to small claims court. So just remember that the security deposit is actually the tenant's money. And so it's as if you gave them a bond or they gave you a bond. And so if you don't return that bond, that is still the tenant's property. And in almost every place I've seen, it's no longer a tenancy issue because we're not talking about housing at this point. We're talking about money. We're talking about this bond. So if the security deposit isn't successfully returned or the itemized list of what you're deducting out of that security deposit isn't returned along with it, in this case in Nebraska, 14 days, then it becomes an issue in small claims court. So there's links in here on how you would go about filing for small claims for the security deposit, how to serve everybody. That's important. And then it goes into discrimination, who is protected, reasonable accommodations for folks with disabilities. This is pretty standard. What if I have a service animal or an emotional support animal? It's talking a little bit more about no pets and asking for a reasonable accommodation to have a pet. And you might have you have a request about reasonable accommodation. And they note this here. This is on page 50. Landlords cannot charge you a pet fee or a deposit for an assistance animal. Landlords cannot have a weight, size, or breed restrictions for an assistant animal. But remember, an assistant animal is not a pet. An assistant animal is doing a job. So just be very careful about this. If there's any questions, make sure you reach out to your local legal aid society or anybody, perhaps your lawyer, regardless, and make sure you understand what you can and cannot cannot charge a deposit or additional rent for. There's all kinds of self-help centers and contact information if a tenant feels like they've been discriminated against, and you must file a complaint within 1 year. And to avoid this type of thing as a landlord, make sure you are doing the same process when you have a potential tenant. It's the exact same process every single time. That's how I do it, is I go, here is this person, who is this? Do they have ID? Do they have a credit? Do they have proof of income? Do they have whatever it is? It's this exact same process every time. It doesn't matter their sex, age, gender, history, ethnicity. It does not matter to me. It doesn't matter if they're pregnant, doesn't matter any of that. It's the exact same process every single time. So that's one good way that you can avoid discriminating or making potential tenants feel like they've been discriminated against. Where to go to help if you cannot afford a lawyer. Now, this is still within the same guiding document about the Nebraska Landlord Tenant Act, and it's still in that same guide. And so on page 52, there is just a laundry list once again about how to get help with landlord and legal aids. And so they've got phone numbers if you're an elder, Native American, rural response, a beginning farmer and rancher development program hotline. I'm not sure why that would be in here, but that is. And then they've got the location of the justice centers in here. Also legal, law school legal clinics. It's got all these hyperlinks in here. That's good. And self-help resources. So lawhelpne.org. And this is Law Help NE is a software program that helps people to represent themselves. So make sure that you're at least reaching out if you need help. But there's also a number of self-help centers. And it says specifically in here, self-help centers are open when the courthouse is open and when volunteers are available. And so it's got a number of different courthouses available: Buffalo County, Douglas, Hall, Kimball, Madison, Scottsbluff County. So it's got in here. And there's just, it goes on and on. There's a number of one other help center. It says Nebraska Free Legal Answers. So www.ne.freelegalanswers.org. And so it says it's for low income Nebraskans, but I'm sure they would help you if you've got a question. Say, you know what, I can't help you, but you might try here. So they've also got referral in here if you need legal representation. And then on page 56, there is sample letters and condition checklists. And so this is the remainder of the document. So you've got 15 pages of sample documents. Okay. Request to make repairs within 14 days, request to make repairs within 14 days, or I will call code enforcement, or a 30-day notice to terminate if repairs are not made within 14 days. I mean, it goes on and on. These are actually really good. And they're almost to the point where you could print them out and then just fill them out. You fill them out longhand. Unfortunately, they're not PDF fillable, but regardless, at least they've got it. Now you'll notice at the end of all of these, it says certificate of service. And what it is that it is just saying that you are attesting that you are actually serving this letter, whether you're the tenant serving it to the landlord or the landlord's serving it to the tenant, that you're actually doing this, whether it's mailed first class or you've delivered it in hand. Yeah, however it is, it's interesting. And by the way, if you deliver it in hand or you post it on their front door, I will post it and I'll write that I posted it at shoulder length, taped on their front door, and then I'll take a picture of it. So just if there's any question, of course, because that picture is then date stamped, if there's any question, then you've still got to put the certificate of service on at the very bottom of each of these forms. Code enforcement, I'm just scrolling down looking at all of these. It's very legalese, but they're actually pretty darn good forms. Oh, notice of abuse of access. This is interesting. So this basically is the tenant saying, hey, back off, man, if the landlord is abusing. So if if you receive one of these, just make sure you're being cognizant that the tenant feels you're abusing access. Interesting. Notice of termination of rental agreement, mutual termination agreement. Every single one of these has a certificate of service in here. Condition checklist. This is okay. It's basically a big spreadsheet that says, at move-in, it's sort of like multiple choice, and there's really no room for comments. So and you just sort of circle everything at move in and then at move out, you do the same thing. I've seen better ones, but this work, it's written, it's better than nothing. And then additional comments, and that's the end of it. I understand. Let's talk a little bit more about nuances in this. We talked about essential services, unlawful ouster, ending due to domestic abuse and criminal activity, absences from the unit, lead paint. We talked about pets and a pet deposit and 14 days for action or 30 days to terminate, which again, I think is really pretty cool. Okay, one thing we didn't talk about is what to do about abandoned items in Nebraska. Now, Nebraska actually has a separate act about this, Disposition of Personal Property, Landlord and Tenant Act. In fact, let me shift the share screen to that. Now, this is the legalese part of it. I wasn't able to find a different guide. I'm sure there is one there, but if this applies to you, this is the act that is going to be governing to it. Nebraska Revised Statutes, Chapter 69, Personal Property, Article 23, Disposition of Personal Property, Landlord Tenant Act, Sections 1 to 14. Now, this I found at baronlaw.com. This is a lawyer that is posting this. And you'll see as you go down, there is actually notice forms in here. A notice to a former tenant which is substantially in the form. So it's giving you a bit of a template of making sure you're trying to get a hold of this former tenant saying, hey, I have your stuff, come and get your stuff. And you vacated the premises at, and then the location of the premises, the following personal property remained, and then you insert the description of the personal property. I highly recommend that you do as detailed of an inventory list as possible so that you can then say, here is where the address where the property can be claimed. And it could be the rental, but as a landlord, you're probably not trying to keep the stuff in the rental because you want to get that rental re-rented, right? You want to get this out and you want to, fix any damages that occurred, whatever. So you're probably going to inventory that items, pack it up, and then put it in storage. So this is basically your effort trying to get the tenant to respond about their personal property. This is very typical. I've seen this in a number of other jurisdictions where you've got, the landlord is got to deal with the former tenant's stuff, and they may or may not ever come back to the stuff. And at some point, the landlord or the warehouseman will be able to sell the property or dispose of the property and recoup some of the costs. I mean, at some point, that is what's going to happen. And so in this document is some of the template forms that you can use. Now, this is, you'll see if you're looking at this on YouTube, you'll see they're not actual templates that you can print, but you can see the wording there. So that is at least something. So this is, it goes on and on about selling and the release of disposition, cost of storage. And let's see, I think we've got it. Where to get help in Nebraska. Now, we've talked a lot about self-help and help resources that is in the guide that we went through. The number one thing that you can do is go to Legal Aid of Nebraska, and their website is legalaidofnebraska.org. You can also call the access line, which is 1-877-250-2016, available Monday to Thursday by phone. And then again, all the self-help centers are all over the state when the courthouse is open and when volunteers are available. But at least you can get started on the Legal Aid Nebraska website and the access line, and that'll at least get you going. Okay, let's wrap this episode up. Each of my location-specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions, including the basics of the Nebraska Landlord Tenant Act, and what are the nuances of Nebraska, what's different, what stands out, some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant, and where to get help in your local real estate, where to get help in your location in Nebraska. So this is the same format for every location specific episode. So if you're interested in another geographic area, know that you already know what I'm going to talk about, just in a different location. But one more time, this episode is not all inclusive. You must further research in your specific area, including your county, regional district, parish, city, other governing body that involves your rental location, but today's episode will at least get you started. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are that you are about to be or already are a landlord in Nebraska. Things you can do to help yourself include read the Nebraska Landlord Tenant Act, and 2, try to get in groups with other like-minded individuals, meaning other landlords in Nebraska. So you can do that either on social media or in person at, for example, local meetup groups. Make sure that you are getting where the local folks asking the questions just like you are. You guys are, it's a think tank, work together. Folks, if you've learned something from today's show, could you pretty please give me a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or maybe you listen to this at mylifeasalandlord.com. It doesn't matter what platform you listen to, but your input really does help. And I hope you enjoyed today's show all about Nebraska. Today, I am recording this episode on board a cruise ship, the Carnival Splendor. We are floating about to dock in New Zealand. And why do I say this? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next episode live right now in the library, episode 130, 130 about the great state of Vermont. I'll see you there.